Hey everybody, this video is called The Reign of Rehoboam, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Chronicles, where we're going to be looking at the reign of Rehoboam. So chapter 10, we're going to get through this chapter fairly quickly. It's only 19 verses. We're going to look at chapter 10, verse 1 through 5, kicking this off. It says, "And Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone to Shechem to make him king. So it happened when Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard it, he was in Egypt, where he had fled from the presence of King Solomon, that Jeroboam returned from Egypt. Then they sent for him and called him, and Jeroboam and all Israel came and spoke to Rehoboam, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father, and his heavy yoke, which he has put on us, and we will serve you. So he said to them, Come back to me after 3 days, and the people departed." So from this point on in the book of 2 Chronicles through the rest of the book, it records all 20 of the Judean rulers in the divided kingdom from Solomon's son Rehoboam from 931 BC all the way to King Zedekiah in 586 BC, when the people were taken then captive into Babylonian captivity. And the righteous kings and the revivals under them are presented, as well as the wicked kings and their disastrous influence among the nation. And the northern kingdom is absent, as the chronicler is focusing on the Davidic line. And from here through chapter 12 this week, as we go through it, you're going to see, you could say it focuses on the reign of just one king this week, Rehoboam, between 931 to 913 BC. And it's also seen back in 1 Kings chapter 12 through chapter 14 that we looked at back kicking the year off in January, February. And in verse 2, Jeroboam became the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel between 931 and 910 BC. And Jeroboam, his story to his return from Egypt comes from 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 26 through 40. And Jeroboam, he was like the foreman of the forced labor in Ephraim and Manasseh who fled to Egypt. And the northern tribes, they aren't placed to accept Rehoboam's rule without negotiating the terms of their allegiance to him. And Rehoboam was out of touch with the mood of the nation, and he requests 3 days respite to formulate his response to the situation. And Rehoboam is the only son that we know of Solomon by name. And Solomon, we know that he wasn't faithful to God's covenant of one man and woman as a marriage union. Solomon practiced where he had 1,000 wives with concubines. Yet we see one son he had to bear up his name, and we see that his son Rehoboam was basically a fool. And this demonstrates that sin is a bad way of building up a family. And Shechem had rich history, as Abraham worshipped there in Genesis chapter 12, verse 6. And Jacob went and built an altar and purchased land there in Genesis 33, verse 18 through 20. And Joseph was buried there in Joshua chapter 24, verse 32. And this was the geographical center of the northern tribe. And Rehoboam is shown in a position of weakness, meeting the 10 tribes in their territory rather than the representatives that came to Jerusalem. And the people of Israel, they offered allegiance to Rehoboam if he relieved them of the pressure they were under, as in heavy taxation and forced service, slavehood, pretty much. And you could say that Solomon would be welcomed with open arms in the Democratic Party today, and probably he would be elected in the state of Massachusetts or California as governor, because we love our taxes in these states. But verse 6 and 7 says, Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he still lived, saying, How do you advise me to answer these people? And they spoke to him, saying, If you are kind to these people and please them and speak good words to them, they will be your servants forever. So we did see a good thing here on Rehoboam. He asked wisely for the counsel of the older, experienced men. And they advised him that he was to connect with the people based on who he was. He wasn't to act differently than who he was. In verse 8 through 11, But he rejected the advice the elders had given him, and consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. And he said to them, What advice do you give? How should we answer this people who have spoken to me, saying, Lighten the yoke which your father put on us? Then the young men who had grown up with him spoke to him, saying, That you should speak to the people who have spoken to you, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. Thus you shall say to them, My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. And that's a weird verse in 10. My finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. But verse 11, it says, And now, whereas my father put a heavy yoke on you, I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. So we see that Rehoboam, he rejected the elders' advice. And we see that Rehoboam, he sought after the younger men that he's familiar with, that he grew up with. And Rehoboam are like some people today who practice what I like to call advice shopping. They will ask around for advice, but they will never listen to the advice until it's something they want to hear. And because they hear it, then they think that it's a wise decision to go with it. But that is the wrong way to take advice. And sometimes people will ask for advice, for wisdom, but they only want to hear those who are closest to them. And they're going to ask many people until they hear what they want to hear. And they'll ask basically for the sake of appearance. And the younger men advice with Rehoboam made him more feared than Solomon was. We see that Rehoboam was a tyrant. And we see Rehoboam would essentially proclaim that his weakness shall be stronger than the might of his father, when he said, My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. He wasn't saying, that his finger was going to be fat or whatever. And the New American Standard Bible uses scorpions instead of scourge in verse 11. And that would have pieces of metal. We know from Jesus' last moments when they whipped him that the scourges had pieces of metal that would rip as they whipped them into their skin. And verse 12 through 15 says, So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the third day, just as the king had directed, saying, Come back to me the third day. Then the king answered him roughly. King Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders, and he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to it. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. So the king did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from God, that the Lord might fulfill his word, which he had spoken by the hand of Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So Rehoboam, he was a fool, and he rose to he would lose his kingdom. And God left Rehoboam to make the critical errors that his heart wanted to make. And it was within God's sovereign purposes for this to happen. And you might know the scripture from Genesis 50, verse 20, where it says, paraphrasing, for what they meant for evil, God meant for good. And you see, even through our bad decisions, our sins, whatever, God can still have his sovereign way. And Abijah's prophecy concerning Jeroboam in 1 Kings 11, 29 through 39 is fulfilled in the turn of events. And God's divine sovereignty extends over the sinful actions of men. And I know people don't like to think about that. But verse 16 through 19 says, now when all Israel saw that the king had not listened to them, the people answered, saying, what share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David. So all Israel departed to their tents. But Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel, who dwelt in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam sent Hadoram, who was in charge of revenue. But the children of Israel stoned him with stones, and he died. Therefore King Rehoboam mounted his chariot in haste to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel had been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. So we see a very dramatic ending here where the chapter ends. And here it's recorded the beginning of the divided kingdom. And we see 10 tribes followed Jeroboam, and they were called Israel. And the other 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah, they stayed loyal in David's line. They accepted Rehoboam's rule, and they were known as Judah. However, Benjamin at times demonstrated split loyalties, as seen back in 1 Kings 12:21. In verse 16, to your tents, O Israel, it was a declaration of rebellion, renouncing Rehoboam's authority. So now we see division taking place, basically almost like a civil war could break out at this point. But to wrap up our chapter for today, we see that the chronicler goes over the reign of Rehoboam and his decisions and his actions. And we see how the elders of Israel offered Rehoboam the throne of Israel. And we see the counsel given from Rehoboam's older advisors. And we also are shown from the counsel given by his younger advisors. We see that Rehoboam proceeds to listen to those that he grew up with, these foolish younger advisors, and he answered Jeroboam and the elders of Israel harshly. And we see a revolt takes place against Rehoboam as Jeroboam leads the leaven, and Rehoboam's we see that he leads the leaven of Rehoboam's rule. And Rehoboam's foolishness made Israel not only to reject him, but to reject the entire dynasty of David. And we see that the chapter ends with a rebellion of Israel against the house of David. And it took Rehoboam's chief tax collector being stoned or murdered, that it took that in order for the 10 tribes to be serious in their rebellion. And Hadoram was the wrong man for Rehoboam to send. In 1 Kings 4, verse 6, and 1 Kings 5:14, it shows that he was famous for his harsh policy of forced labor. And we see that he was one of the most hated in the land. He was a representation of oppression. And Rehoboam's tough guy policy did not work. And sometimes for leaders, acting like a tough guy is only going to bring your approval rating down. And we see that his tough guy policy did not work. And that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next as we look at the defection of the Levites for chapter 11 to be announced. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless, and we'll see you for our next study.